#1 news site, now better than ever. Watch news happen in real time with more video than any other news site. Connect to cbcnews.ca.
Welcome back. Our next guest is a value investor like Warren Buffett, and just like the Oracle of Omaha, he sees buying opportunities in Japan. Lorne Steinberg is the president of Steinberg Wealth Management. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to meet both of you.
The last time you were in, back in November, Amanda interviewed you, and you were very, very bullish on Japan at the time. I want to ask you, first of all, how those positions that you held were affected by the disaster.
We hold about 10 positions in Japan, most of which we've owned. We started buying it last June. A number of them several have risen sharply because their infrastructure plays, including a couple of companies I'll talk about tonight. The worst performer, if you will, is an engineering company I might have mentioned last time, Futaba, which is down about 11%. But the fact of the matter is Japan was such a depressed market for such a long time that, quite frankly, even with this terrible human disaster, the market's down probably less than 10%.
Let's leave the disaster alone for a second and ask one of the fundamental questions that always challenges on the equity side of Japan. If you have this thesis that you really can't accelerate past GDP growth for an extended period of time if you're a company servicing the economy, they have no GDP growth. So what's the investment thesis to own any equities in Japan?
I'll tell you exactly what the thesis is, and the only companies that we're focusing on are what Benjamin Graham referred to as golden opportunities. Companies which, all of our companies have no debt, but companies that are trading for less than their cash or their working capital and also have profitable businesses. So we are literally buying the cash at a discount and getting a profitable dividend-paying business for free. And the other thing we're looking for, we've stayed away from things like Japanese retailers which only are stuck to Japan, and focused more on companies with export, because Japan is the largest exporter to China. And so I 100% agree with the thesis. There's no question Japan remains in a zero growth mode, and with all the issues are, huge government debt, and really the biggest issue, quite frankly, is no immigration. That will change over time because it has to, and nothing ever stays static, but that is the reason we've stayed away from those pure domestic plays.
Does that zero growth pattern continue from here? Because I know one of the criticisms of Japan has been that sort of over 20 years it put stimulus in, but it was only $1 trillion over 20 years. Exactly. Now that they're going to have to rebuild huge parts of the economy, is that an opportunity for them to kind of rectify that?
This is what we see happening. There's no question in the short term there'll be a massive, massive input of stimulus. The Japanese government, the central bank, is well aware of all the mistakes of the past. They've written about them continuously for the last couple of years. The big question is, after this big rebuild happens, and it'll take several years, what happens then? The Japanese government under Prime Minister Kan has actually done a couple of interesting things. First of all, they just named an opposition member as the finance minister, which is a radical thing to do because they're desperate to get bipartisan support. It would be like Stephen Harper naming a liberal as finance minister. Imagine that ever happening. And they've cut the tax rate, the corporate tax rate, but they've more aggressively cut the tax rate to encourage foreign corporations to open up in Japan. So this is a radical departure for Japan. You're also hearing a lot of talk, and we're reading a lot in the Japanese newspapers and all over the place. The government wants to address the immigration. They have, the issue is no different from here. They have the same low birth rate that we have the rest of the Western world. The difference is here we encourage immigration. There's been no question, a huge cultural aversion to immigrants. But you are already seeing the young Japanese, everybody's on the internet, the globalization is impacting Japan as well. And these young people are growing up and they're less afraid of immigrants, quite frankly. And so we see these changes happening.
So you have a long-term thesis here. Now let's focus on the immediate, because I'm actually bullish on the result of this tragedy, let's call it that, and the horrific loss of human life. But now I'm watching Japanese companies rebuild, but not necessarily in Japan. They're putting the new plants and their other operations in lower-cost jurisdictions, which I think will enhance earnings for them, and perhaps knowing that they're servicing places like China, they want a bigger piece. So we may not get a $1-for-$1 ratio of rebuild in Japan, is my thesis. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. In fact, among the companies we're talking about tonight, a couple of infrastructure companies, CTI Engineering and Sanyo, both of those companies have offices elsewhere in Asia, and you know, it's a part of their business. And these Japanese companies, they're bright businesses. So many of them have zero debt, Kevin. They all have long histories of zero debt, paying dividends, running incredibly conservative businesses. They've been around for many decades, and they know exactly what's going on, and they're looking out, they're moving, they're doing what everybody else is doing.
Both those companies you mentioned, I think, were kind of a play on growth in China, right? Sort of construction in China. And so my question would be, because I'm not sure I agree with Kevin that these companies are going to be setting shop abroad, are they going to be bringing business back into Japan to help with the rebuilding?
Sure, both of these companies are going to have way too much work for them to handle with the rebuild in Japan that will go on for years. Both of these companies will be working at, you know, capacity plus. Sanyo Engineering already has offices in China and elsewhere. They build electrical facilities, water treatment, ventilation for new construction. And so, of course, China is a huge place. But they're not huge companies. So, I mean, Japan will keep them busy, but they intend to keep their other operations and to build them.
We've got to leave it there. Lorne Steinberg, thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for having me.
It's time now for our priceless moment and the importance of having a good fashion role model like Kevin here.